Welcome back to Rise to Liberty podcast. Today I am joined again with Derrick Broze. We've got a very dark and disturbing topic to cover today that kind of needed its own episode. So, uh, just let's see. It was a week ago that we had talked, correct?
Yeah, last Monday, I think.
Yeah. So make sure and go check out that episode. We discussed the exit and build strategy, which is incredibly important in our trying times. Um, Before we get started, go and scan that QR code. That is the Rise to Liberty master link that will take you to all the good things to help out the channel and everything. Go donate. We always need help to keep this broadcast rolling and keep bringing you awesome guests like Derrick here. So let's just jump straight into it. We've kind of got a tight schedule, both you and I. So let's just jump straight into it. Today's topic is Utah ritual abuse and the case of David Hamblin. So do you kind of want to give a rundown of what exactly the case of David Hamblin is?
Sure. So I think it was May 2022, the Utah County Sheriff's Office announced that they were conducting an investigation into what they called, in their own words, ritualized child sexual abuse. And I heard about this a couple days after it happened. Obviously, when you use those kind of terms, that's going to set off some alarm bells and get people at the very least curious, like, what the heck is this about? Obviously, anytime there's child abuse in general, it's a horrible thing, and it's something we want to put an end to. But when you add that word ritualized into there, it sort of brings up some different thoughts for different people. And obviously, from a mainstream, whatever you want to say, normie NPC perspective, it's something that people are very dismissive of. This idea that there is a ritualistic or even religious, or some would use the word satanic element to child abuse that does happen in various areas. And I have covered similar stories to this. For those who are familiar with my work, back in 2019, I produced a documentary called Who Will Find What the Finders Hide, about the Finders cult, in 1987. And that's a whole nother story as well, but it does involve child abuse, trafficking with connections to intelligence communities, and things like that. So I'd kind of already been versed in this, of course, been researching Jeffrey Epstein since 2016, and made a documentary about him as well, and have, generally speaking, tried to keep up with these types of cases. People can think of like the Franklin scandal. You can think of the McMartin preschool. There's been a number of them over the years. That's just in the U.S. You could go even international and look at Jimmy Savile and the Dutroux affair and other things like this. This is a very prevalent problem, unfortunately. So it's something I've kept my eye on. And when I learned about this sheriff's announcement, they put out a press release, as I mentioned, and things got strange very quickly. Like, as soon as I heard about it, things had already been strange within the first week. And so I'll kind of set the stage to what happened back in 2022, and then we can talk more about where things are now, what's happened in the years since then. But the first thing was that the sheriff made this announcement and said, we are looking for victims who have been abused in 3 different Utah counties between the 90s and the mid 2000s. I can't remember the exact dates. And they were looking for victims, as well as just anybody else who has evidence or information related to ritualized child sexual abuse. And I found out about it. I contacted the sheriff's office, talked to their public information officer, and he confirmed that this was legit. It was on their, it's on their website. It's still there. You can find it. And that this was an investigation, and is an investigation that's ongoing. And he told me that they had, at that time, I think at this point, they've heard from more than 300 people who've reached out with either tips or saying they were victims in one way or different things like that. So this is very much a real investigation, a serious investigation. It's not some QAnon thing. It's not, just whatever, crazy people on the internet. This is police putting their names out there and saying, hey, we're investigating real evidence of crimes that we've been told about. And things took a really weird twist right away, because at that time, so go back to May going into June 2022, there was a local investigation, a local election happening in Utah, not only for the sheriff, his election was coming up, but also the Utah County attorney the election was coming up for that in the summer of 2022. And at the time of the announcement from the sheriff's office, the county attorney was a man named David Levitt. And David Levitt is the son of Dixie Levitt, I believe is his father's name, and a very powerful person in Utah, and owns one of the biggest insurance companies. They're all deeply connected into the Mormon church. And David Levitt's brother is the former governor of Utah. So, just a powerful political family overall. And when the sheriffs made their first announcement, they didn't name any names and say, hey, we have this suspect we're looking at, or, anything. They didn't really make any kind of accusation. They just said, hey, if you've got information, and yeah, on the screen for those who are watching, that's Sheriff Mike Smith on the right side of your screen, and that's David Levitt on the left side. And so David Levitt, though, again, county attorney, not named in any way in the investigation, decides to host his own press conference the day after or within a couple of days of the sheriff's announcement. And he gave out, it was, I think, a 150-page document at the time to the local press there in Utah, because some of the press has actually been doing a pretty good job on this case. And so he said, I'm going to hold a press conference because I want to talk about this investigation the sheriffs are doing. He gives out some documents to the people that are in attendance, and he essentially just comes out of nowhere, comes out of left field and says, this is a politically motivated investigation. Sheriff Mike Smith is coming after me because he knows that I'm up for re-election, and this is just a political ploy to try to make me look bad. And the reporters are kind of all curious because, as I mentioned, nobody's name had been named. Levitt hadn't been named in any way as a suspect or anything like that. And then he goes even further and said, me and my wife are not cannibals. We are not child abusers. We are not pedophiles. But the documents that he had handed out to the press at the press conference, he had acknowledged and admitted, he's like, but my wife and I were accused of such acts back 10 years ago, back in 2012, by what he called what did he call her? I think he said a mentally deranged person.
Yeah, very
something
mentally
like that.
Ill woman.
Yeah, mentally ill woman, something to that effect. And just totally, like I said, I mean, for one thing, it's kind of a weird move to make. Like, if you're not named in an investigation, just to go ahead and kind of, I don't know if he thought this was a wise move, like he was going to preempt something coming about him later. And he figured, hey, you know what? Why don't I just step up to the plate and say, hey, guys, the sheriff is politically motivated. He's trying to get me out of office based on some old claims. And he said, yeah, like this was coming from a mentally ill person, et cetera. And the media just sort of didn't know how to respond to it. But as I mentioned, it's just kind of like a weird twist in it. So when I dive into the investigation, I caught wind of what Levitt said. I caught wind of what the sheriffs announced. I also was able to get a copy of the report, the documents that Levitt was giving out to the press. And it was indeed related to a 2012 case against another man named David Hamblin. And before we get into Hamblin, I'll just say this, that when I was first initially reporting, you can find my articles at The Last American Vagabond that you were just showing there. And then I have video breakdowns and other interviews related to the overall Utah ritual abuse case that you can find at theconsciousresistance.com. But when I was first investigating it, I did get a copy of their victim statements. Basically, it's like 150 pages of several different victim statements making accusations against this former therapist, this disgraced man named David Hamblin. But because David Hamblin, and those documents do indeed mention David Levitt and his wife, I can't remember his wife's name right now, but both of them were named as being part of some alleged Church of Satan, kind of a group of people, a cult, if you will, that are active in different counties in Utah and are members of the Church of Mormon, the Mormon Church, and they are accused of. I mean, it's literally hundreds of different incidents described in these pages by multiple alleged victims. And I'm talking about levels of detail that are, beyond the depravity that the average person could even think up or dream up. And I was hesitant to even report on those things at first because, as I mentioned, the sheriffs didn't make any names known. So in my view, and again, as I take my journalism very seriously, and I don't want to just be some conspiracy theorist just making accusations on the internet. Although David Levitt said, hey, this is related to some 2012 case, we didn't have any evidence at that time. So I did have the documents. I looked through them and I kind of reported on them. But for the first few months of the case, until we got the first arrest, which would be of David Hamblin, I figured like, look, he's a private citizen. He was accused of something in 2012, but as far as we know, this is not what the case is about in 2022, 2023, and 2024. So I kind of just gingerly stepped around those documents, although, the documents are now relevant. And that's kind of all we knew, is that the sheriffs were announcing an investigation. The Utah county attorney made some weird press conference. He ended up leaving office after that. He didn't win his election. And he now, in another strange twist of events that I don't think we fully know the truth of yet, but I think it's kind of telling. David Levitt and his wife just picked up and moved to Scotland and bought a castle. And now they're like Instagram influencers showing how they are repairing this like 18th century castle. And I think part of it is to get away whatever may be coming in relation to this case, because a couple months later, David Hamblin, again, the therapist that was accused in 2012 of numerous incidents of abuse and of being a part of this cult that was performing ritualized abuse of children, he was arrested by the Utah County Sheriff's Office later that year. Now, one thing to make clear is that the Utah Sheriff's Office have said that this is not related to the 2012 case. And they could just be covering their asses right now at the moment and not, saying too much. But it is important to understand that when David Hamblin was accused of these horrific things, including by his own daughters in 2012, the charges against him were dismissed in 2014, but they were not dismissed because he was found not guilty or because there was no evidence. It was dismissed what they call without prejudice, which means that it could be brought up again. And what the lawyers said at that time was that the court was dragging their feet and they basically just couldn't get them to give them the evidence they needed, the documentation they needed to actually be able to prosecute David Hamblin. So, under Constitution and the rule of law, if they can't charge you with anything, they have to let you go. So after they held him for a little bit in 2014, they eventually dropped the charges. Then you fast forward a decade later to 2022, the county sheriff's office announces this investigation into ritualized child abuse. David Levitt has this really weird press conference, moves to Scotland, and then a few months later, they do indeed arrest David Hamblin. And David Hamblin has been indicted and is currently he's on house arrest right now. Unfortunately, they let him out on a $100,000 bail. And he does have wealthy friends around him. And he is being charged with multiple counts of sodomy of a child, of sexual abuse of a child. His ex-wife, Roselle Stevenson, formerly Roselle Hamblin, was also arrested as well in the last year. And she is similarly being charged with sodomizing of children and sexual abuse. Just like I said, it gets pretty dark and disgusting. Even the things that we know for sure they're accused of, not even to get into the 2012 documents, which are much, much deeper, much darker. And I do think those will come into play at the moment, but at the moment they haven't. So as it stands, 2 people have been arrested in this sheriff's investigation into ritualized child sexual abuse. David Hamblin, disgraced therapist, former member of the church, and his ex-wife, Roselle Stevenson, have both been arrested and charged and are awaiting trial. As I mentioned, David Hamblin is on house arrest right now, so he's wearing an ankle monitor. But even up to this point, things have just been dragging. Like once again, it's kind of like a repeat of 10 years ago. The lawyers who are trying to prosecute him are having trouble getting any documentation, doing discovery, and it's been a big mess. So I've been following it. I've written, half a dozen or more articles on this, and I've interviewed other people who I can get into all this further, who are connected to David Hamblin, who have been in his inner circle where he does peyote rituals, or at least he pretends to be some kind of shaman. And I think that's really just his cover for abusing people and allegedly hypnotizing people. But yeah, and this is all part of what many people believe is a much bigger cult. I will want to mention there are others out there in Utah. Jenny Hatch is one of them who's been following us closely. Another gentleman who goes by the name Goel, G-O, and then E-L. He does a Substack called Investigations into Ritual Abuse. And he has been staying on it just as much as I have, probably more than I have on like the nitty gritty details, because he's based there in Utah. And he believes strongly that the 2012 documents that detail these horrific examples of abuse, and I can go further into them in a little bit if we want to. I mean, I'm talking about like incantations to Lucifer and wearing dead people's skin and, stuff that like you've only seen or heard in horror movies, which hasn't been proven in a court of law, and these people are innocent until proven guilty. but it absolutely does appear like there's more people than just the two people who've been arrested who are involved in these alleged activities. And it's been 2 years since the arrest, or since the announcement of the investigation. It's been, almost 2 years now since David Hamblin's first arrest and his wife, and it still hasn't gone to court. Now, that might be changing very soon because of some recent hearings that have happened, where it finally seems like, the judges are getting their asses in gear and ready to move forward and actually get some evidence put into the record. And I think that's what anybody who may be involved in this is afraid of, afraid that this will actually go to trial, and then that the evidence will be allowed to present. So that's a bit of what's been going on the last couple of years.
So one thing I do want to touch on before we get into, the specifics, or wherever we end up going exactly with this. But one thing I want to know is, like you had mentioned, you have done investigations into other cases such as this, such as like the Finders, which I just rewatched your documentary the other day about the Finders, and it's killer. I absolutely recommend it to anyone. It is very, very well done. And because it's a very complicated case, and it's like, what do you believe? What do you not believe? Like, there's just a lot of information surrounding that. And I think what you did was an incredible job. So thanks for releasing that. Honestly, it's really great. So one thing I want to know is, after having investigated into these things, what do you feel? What is your personal opinion about, I guess, the sensation? Because you also mentioned that when you bring the word ritual into it, it kind of brings this like supernatural belief into it, and people are easily dismissive of it. Although that's not what the word exactly means, but that's not exactly the people don't really think about things like that. So what exactly is your feelings towards it?
Sure. And I just actually sent you a link if you want to share it on there. This is the link I sent you is an older article I wrote maybe about a year ago called Are the Children Lying? Re-examining the Satanic Panic. Because I think if we're going to talk about this issue, it's important to kind of maybe go a little further back and look at the broader picture, because in the 70s and the 80s and going into the early 90s, there were widespread reports of ritual abuse. Again, the term satanic sometimes gets thrown around, which I don't always think is an accurate, description, but it's out there. And this was existing in parts of Europe and in the United States. And it was prevalent. And that article, so this is one thing is when I started to investigate this, I will say this, so many sources reached out to me to tell their stories to me, and including that, what led me to write that article. And you can see that screenshot right there where it says, Are the Children Lying? That was a journalist named Brad Edwards from Oklahoma City here in the States. And he did this like 4-part series called Are the Children Lying? Where it was like, it's like you imagine local news, like this week, my special investigation. And he did that in the 90s, looking at claims of satanic activity, claims of child abuse involving various ritualized elements. And a recording of that on a VHS was sent to me by a source who follows my work and who said, hey, you need to see some of these older reports. And I wanted to include that and then write this article to kind of, like I say, to re-examine the so-called satanic panic, because what that term is used to do, or what people who kind of downplay these situations, sure, of course, they have to admit, okay, Jeffrey Epstein, yeah, okay, that's a real thing now, but let's not talk about his intelligence connections. He was just some rich, depraved billionaire. Or they'll see like, okay, well, the Boy Scouts, they got caught abusing child, but that's just one example. Okay, well, the Catholic Church or the Second Baptist Church or the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witness, at some point you have to acknowledge that this is a society-wide all pervasive problem that goes beyond, you can find it in all religions, all ethnicities, lifestyles. It's not just, I've heard some people say like, oh, it's just homosexuals or things like it's prevalent, unfortunately, across the board, all sectors of society. Levels of wealth apparently, appear to like higher levels of wealth appear to be involved in this. And I don't think it's as easy to dismiss as some people might like to. Like, for example, the Vice News and others who, even with the Finders, they put out an article a few years ago saying, oh, looking at the Finders case, this is the origin of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And they totally ignore all the evidence that I presented in my documentary and other things like that. That term satanic panic is intended to imply that everybody who was talking about these things back in the 70s and 80s and 90s was just panicking. It was a moral panic, right? And to be clear, to be frank, there was some of that going on. If you look back in the 80s and 90s, like, for example, you had these different parents coming out and saying, like, Dee Snider and some of these metal bands were corrupting the youth and they're making them commit satanic, rituals. And I think that, there's an argument for the corruption of the entertainment industry, obviously, in the music industry. I think there's some truth to that. But at the same time, there's always going to be conservative, whatever you want to say, parents who are like, oh, somebody think of the children, right? And it can go too far to the point of like, I mean, I don't know about you, but I listened to a lot of crazy shit when I was younger. I listened to Marilyn Manson, I listened to all kinds of stuff, Slayer, I listened to Deicide, bands that do call themselves satanic. And I turned out okay. Like, I'm not a Satanist, I watched all kinds of horrible movies. Like, not everybody's going to be turned into some, whatever, killer because they listen to metal or whatever. So I do think that there was a true moral panic in that sense, that there were parents who were like flipping out about everything, right? And like, oh, Magic, the board game, is turning kids into sorcery or whatever, right? But there also were legitimate cases that did take place in that time period, including the Finders in 1987 and the Franklin scandal around the same time, and other cases that did fit the bill of, at the very least, child abuse networks. And sometimes there did appear to be levels of, I don't know if Satanism is the right word, or Luciferian or whatever, but some sort of ritualized element to it. And so I just want to make that clear that, yes, because some people will hear this and immediately be like, oh, this is just satanic panic, blah, blah, whatever. This is, same old thing. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, not to get too off track, but there's this writer that I really can't stand. She is called the misinformation expert for NBC. Her name's Brandy Zadrozny, and her and I actually had a little bit of a back and forth. She writes articles about conspiracy theories, and she totally tried to dismiss and downplay the Utah situation, this investigation, and basically just say it's just Republican sheriffs who are into QAnon and this and that, and totally ignored, any of the evidence that was presented in 2012. And, like I said, I had people sending me this tape of Are the Children Lying? I had a woman named Kate Talley, who I've interviewed 2 times on my website, who knew David Hamblin, who her ex-husband, Eldon Talley, was David Hamblin's best friend for a good period of time. And so she witnessed a lot of this stuff firsthand. She said she felt like she was physically abused in some ways, but also like psychologically and mentally abused by her ex-husband under the direction of David Hamblin. And I presented all that information. I put the story out there. I was able to corroborate that, yes, Kate did know him. This isn't just somebody making shit up. And Brandy Zadrozny and NBC, and of course the mainstream, as we know they do, they just totally ignore this and say, oh, this is QAnon 2.0, blah, blah. And the funny thing is, the sad thing really is that she wrote these hit pieces, which is what I think they are, after the announcement of the investigation and after the press conference, and kind of like laughing and pointing at, oh, look at those crazies in Utah. But then they haven't reported anything since the arrest have actually taken place, anything to kind of legitimize the investigation. Since then they've ignored it. And so she reached out to me and asked if I would do an interview with her. And she wanted me to ask me some questions about my work on this situation with her producer from NBC. And I actually screen recorded the entire call. You can find that on my website. It's called Conversation with a Misinformation Expert or something like that. And it's very telling. It's about an hour long. And honestly, I'm pretty proud of my ability to just dodge her BS, because she kept trying to, do the thing that the funny thing is, she is a misinformation expert. She's an expert on spreading misinformation, not detecting it. Like, it's the opposite of what she claims to be. But there's some really telling points in there where, like, I got her pinned down, and, she's like, yeah, I saw you reporting on Kate, but, Derrick, if, anybody can make claims, and, don't you think as a journalist, it's not credible to just put those accusations out there? And I said, look, I fact check what Kate told me. I confirmed she had a relationship. I confirmed those things are real. Of course, I wasn't in the room when she claims this abuse was happening, or the abuse that she said happened to her as a kid. But I think it's important to put it out there. And then Brandy Zadrozny, at one point, she says something like, well, of course, as a woman, my tendency is to want to listen to women. And I said, except if they say they've been abused by, satanic cult, right? Because then they're just crazy. And she's like, it's just an interesting conversation. I encourage folks to go watch that, because it not only can you see her mindset, she even admitted to me, she said something like, well, I will report on something once somebody in a position of authority has confirmed it. And that's what it all comes down to, is like, oh, so you're going to just wait for the government to say, like, oh yeah, like, here's a satanic cult, feel free to report on it. But until then, it's just conspiracy theories. It's just crazy people. And it's really sad, because like I said, she's doing a huge disservice to the truth, which she claims to care about. And that she hasn't done a single report on it since then, when David Hamblin was arrested, when David Hamblin's ex-wife was arrested, any of that. Like, if she truly cared about believing women or whatever, then she would be, looking deeper into it. And so I say all that to say that Vice News, NBC, all the mainstream, they treat stories like this is just satanic panic 2.0. That's what they often will even call it. This is QAnon. This is like, just another form of that old scaremongering we heard about in the 80s and the 90s. And I also want to say that that doesn't mean I believe that every single case you could find out there, people talk about on the internet in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was true or turned out to be what people may have claimed it. Sure, there are incidents where people may have exaggerated stories for one reason or another. But generally speaking, what the mainstream says, they call it false memory syndrome. And they claim that all of these cases are just people going to the therapist, and maybe they have some issue and they start talking, and then the therapist tries to, oh, well, were you ever abused, by a satanic cult, and just like put ideas in their head. Yep. And the whole thing has been discredited. Like, there's an organization that still is around. The therapists that are around, they were involved in a lot of shady shit, from JFK to other things. I mean, there's so many, that's like a whole web of other things. But the point is, they believe in their mind, any talk of this is just false memory syndrome, implanted memories. It's not to be taken seriously, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's how they've convinced the masses to not even pay attention to these issues.
So I pulled up on screen. It's a thread that I've been diving into. I sent it to you, Derrick, so you could check it out at a later date. But it's actually diving into the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and its connections to MK Ultra and a bunch of psychiatrists who have CIA connections, and it is a wild tale, wild tale. And just a couple of quick facts. False memory syndrome is not in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostics manual for all psychiatrists in the mental health field. It's never been given as an official diagnosis because it doesn't exist. And so I just find it really interesting, all of these connections that it's really hard to ignore. And like you said, it's been used to discredit pretty much any and all claims of this. And what I find interesting is that we as people and we as a society all can agree that these things exist separately. Cults exist, Satanists exist, abuse happens, like all of these things happen. But once you put any of it together, it's like, oh, you're just crazy. And I agree with you. There are definitely some cases out there that are moral panic. And I think, my conspiracy hat tells me that was probably exacerbated on purpose to at least a small extent. But there are definitely cases that are not legitimate, but then that doesn't mean that there are no cases. And so I always found that really interesting.
So I think that's done on purpose. And I look forward to checking out that thread that you have there, because that's an important part, the dissection of the false memory syndrome foundation or association, because that is the kind of thing that the Brandys, the Zadrozny's of the world are going to pull up every time. It's like, no, look, this organization says it's just a false memory that's been implanted into these people. And then that's the end of the conversation as far as they're concerned. But like you said, there is some shady connections to the folks who are involved in promoting those ideas.
Yeah, and it's just really disturbing. Yeah, I think you'll like it a lot. I've put a lot of work into it. Not that other people haven't before. There's plenty of other people that have reported on it, and I believe you've done a little bit of reporting on it as well. But to get back to the David Hamblin case, so David Hamblin and his ex-wife, his former wife, have been arrested. So what is the current state of everything as of now?
So about, I want to say a month or so ago, there was a hearing for David Hamblin, and that was what I was kind of touching on earlier, that it's getting to the point where there had to be a rally outside of the courthouse. There had to be a flooding of calls. I was calling, other people were calling. I think we had at least 100 plus people calling because they were about to dismiss the case against David Hamblin again, because it's dragged on so long. And again, like legally, you can't hold somebody indefinitely if you don't present evidence, right? And that's one way that the system can kind of get out of things. And what I mean by that is the sort of swamp creatures within the system. So an arrest takes place. That shows that the Utah County Sheriff's Office, as far as I could tell, they are taking this case very seriously. They've made the arrest, they announced the investigation, but of course they're not the prosecutors. That's somebody else's job. So they can make the arrest, they can hold somebody in jail, but after a certain period of time, if no evidence has been presented, if nothing goes to trial, because we all have under the Constitution, the right to a speedy trial, even accused satanic pedophiles, then you have to be released legally. That's just how it goes, for better or worse. And so it's been, as I mentioned, 2 years now. It's dragged on, like one hearing. Because the thing is, Hamblin is accused of abuse in multiple different counties. So you kind of have Juab County, and then there's I think out in Manti, like multiple cities where these things are going on. So you've got multiple judges, and some of them have been consolidated. So it can get a little bit confusing. But overall, the point is that no evidence has been presented at this point. Nothing has gone to trial. It's just been a number of hearings. Like I said, they let him out on bail. He's been trying to get the ankle monitor off. Thankfully, they do not allow him to take the ankle monitor, because that would be even worse situation than him being out, because I mentioned Kate Talley earlier. Kate does not feel safe that he's out, and other victims have said they don't feel safe that he's out, even with an ankle monitor on him. And so they've been trying to pressure the court to like move things forward. And there's just so many shady things that have happened, from, for example, the original judge prosecuting his case, getting a promotion to somewhere else, and then all of a sudden some new judge coming in. And some of these various individuals have been even named in the 2012 case, the documents where the daughters and the other alleged victims allege this cult behavior. And I will talk more about that in a moment. So, this is the thing, is it's not just members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, which is, some of them are in there, or former members. But what it appears to be is that they kind of created their own, again, some call it the Church of Satan within the Church of Mormon, whatever name they give themselves, if they give themselves a name at all. It's a group of people that live in and around Utah and various counties, from what we can tell, that are involved in bringing kids to parties, abusing them, apparently killing children, and lots of depraved things. At least that's what they were accused of in 2012. And the names are in there. That's the other crazy thing. And as I mentioned with Goel, with investigations into ritual abuse, he has focused more on those documents. I'm trying to do the put on my objective journalist hat and say, like, yes, those documents, they're important, they're interesting. If anybody wants to go down those rabbit holes, I have copies of all those documents. I have copies of I have copies, like video evidence of the victims' statements, of them sharing their stories. This is very difficult shit to listen to. Like, it's not a nice afternoon thing you want to tune into. But if you want to know those things, it is available. But innocent till proven guilty, those people are walking around freely. And in fact, I'll tell you one situation. Another gentleman who was accused in there, his name's Joe Bunyan, I believe. He actually he is listed and he's a pottery guy. He has a pottery shop in Utah that still exists. He's listed and named several times in these documents. And the other thing is, like, when the alleged victims describe it, they say that these individuals have given themselves names. So I believe Mr. Bunyan, or one of the other gentlemen in there, is named the Punisher, because they were known to dish out the most horrific and worst, punishment to these children, including putting them in like 2x2 boxes and cramped boxes for hours at a time, making them wear the skin of other children who allegedly had just been killed recently, and him wearing the skin while raping these young kids, incantations and alleged prayers mentioning Lucifer and things of this sort. Like, this is all listed in the 2012 documents. And the people who are mentioned in there, who are still innocent until proven guilty, are walking around freely. And so people like Goel at Investigations for Ritual Abuse have tried to dig further into that. And like, who are these people and who are their relation? And he's found a lot of interesting things like, hey, these folks seem to live near each other. And look, one of the judges lives in the same neighborhood as the same person that's accused in this document. Just a really tangled web, which makes me honestly doubt that we will get true justice. I think if there is going to be any sort of punishment, if it ever gets to that point, it'll probably just be, it'll land on David Hamblin and his wife, and they'll act like, well, we got some bad guys and that's it. And the bigger implications of the 2012 documents will probably never be explored. And that will be unfortunate if there aren't further arrests. But so as it stands right now, like I mentioned, the case almost got dismissed against David Hamblin. Myself, Jenny Hatch, and some others, we called for like protests for people to call the office, and thankfully they did call them. And because of that public pressure, they assigned a new prosecutor to David Hamblin's case just about a month and a half ago. And if that didn't happen, then the case would have been dismissed, because as I mentioned, I think I said judge earlier, it wasn't the judge, it was the prosecutor. The prosecutor that was on Hamblin's case magically got a promotion. So then there was no prosecutor. Oh, so then things just stall and nothing happens. And then, oops, hey, if we don't have a prosecutor, we can't prosecute the case. So we're going to have to let this guy out of prison. So we started emailing them, calling them, saying like, look, you need to take this case seriously. And within 12 hours, they assigned, I think it's Sean Reyes is the lawyer. And that's kind of where it has the most recent thing. I think Hamblin's had one or two other hearings, but nothing really consequential has happened yet. But now there's a new attorney assigned to it. The discovery process is allegedly going to start soon. And for those who don't know what discovery means, it just means in court, that's when you actually get access to documents. So they can request like, okay, we want to get Mr. Hamblin's emails, or we want to get his phone records, or any sorts of documentation that they can get to start to build their case and prove the allegations against him. So he is still on house arrest. I don't believe his ex-wife might still be in jail. I don't remember ever hearing about her being released on a bond or on house arrest either, but she may be out, but I don't believe so. So, the cases still haven't gone anywhere. We still haven't had a court date, where we're going to actually have a lawyer presenting the evidence and victims are going to be brought in and allowed to testify. That is what we hope for, because if that happens, then obviously that opens the door up for things to go a bit wider. Now, the best case scenario for David Hamblin, for his ex-wife, and for these alleged members of this broader cult, if it does indeed exist, is that he pleads out and nothing goes to court, right? Like, and that's always the way to cover up things. Is so maybe the courts offer Hamblin a deal and say, okay, well, if you plead guilty on this charge or this charge, we will give you, this amount of time, and then, we'll be done with the case. And that would be great for the people who are potentially implicated, because they don't want it to go to trial. They don't want victims to be brought into the courtroom. They don't want questions to be asked about accomplices and things of that sort. And in, David Hamblin, he does, as I mentioned earlier, have some wealthy benefactors. He got out on $100,000 bail. He doesn't have that money himself, but there are some members of the Church of Mormon who are still connected to him and who still support him financially, including Eldon Talley, who I mentioned earlier, who the woman Kate I spoke to, her ex-husband. He is apparently one of his biggest financial benefactors and has been for years. So for one reason or another, he's got money behind him that are willing to help him and support him. And he's got people behind him that still claim that he is innocent. And, at the moment, the evidence has not been brought to court. It hasn't been proven in court. We just have allegations from 2012. We have Kate Talley's words. We have a few different alleged victims who've come forward and spoken to the news in Utah. And, that's all we've got right now. So that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm trying to be objective about as much as possible. But yes, this man and his wife and a number of other people who haven't been indicted or arrested yet are accused of some of the most horrific things that I've ever had the displeasure of reading about. And, just to that note, it's the same thing with the finders. These things it's not a fun, like, I don't know. I feel like sometimes in the conspiracy culture, in the research community, people kind of, in some weird twisted way, kind of get off to like the depravity. And I don't mean like sexually. I just mean like we look for the most salacious details of like, is there a celebrity involved in this and that? And it's like, this is real life. Like if these things are real, it's horrific. And the reason I take the time to read the documents, not only so that I'm, informed on what is being alleged, but also because if it is true, And I have a hard time stomaching reading the words of these people, these women describing, and I'm not talking about just 2 incidents, hundreds of incidents described in detail, times, names, places. Like, I don't know how you just make that shit up. If those things are
Same.
real, these people had to live through it, and the least I can do as a journalist, as a reporter, as somebody who gives a shit, is to read the documents and then to communicate that to the wider public, right? Because if they had to live through it, the least I can do is to read about it, share their stories, and try to help bring justice. It's not because I think, oh, like, look, let's find the most crazy detail in here and write an article about it. Like, I'd rather this stuff was fake. I wish it was fake. And I hope maybe maybe that's the conclusion. That would be the best case scenario. But based on what I've learned in this case and what I've learned in other cases, I have no doubt that something to the effect of what these alleged victims are describing is true. And so I just want to make that clear, that this isn't like, it's not like sometimes people get caught in the conspiratainment of it all. Like, it's just like, it's important to investigate these things. And I think it tickles a certain part of our brain that wants to understand the world better. But let's not forget that there are real victims involved in these situations, that there are real people who had to go through this fucked up, actions, and they're just trying to get their stories out there. And some of them are terrified still to this day. They don't want to talk. They don't want to go public because of what they are afraid and what they were told, especially in the case of the Utah situation, where the victims were told that if they communicated this to anybody, they would be killed, their families would be killed, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and I think that's incredibly noble of you, but I also think it's incredibly important to take that time and to be careful with this, because we want to be able to avoid these cases where maybe somebody was wrongly accused. And I think this is incredibly important because I'm with you. I don't want to be right about certain things. I wish I really could just be written off as a crazy conspiracy theorist sometimes, and it's like, take any subject, not even just this one, but I wish I wasn't right about a lot of things. I don't want to be. This isn't fun for me most of the time, and I'm sure you feel the same way. And so I think that's incredibly important that you do things like that. And I think everyone should, everyone listening to this should take a lesson from doing that. That even talking about these things, you should remember there are real people involved. And I myself am located in Utah. And I'll tell you that the community here in the state, it's pretty split. It's about half the people saying these things exist, these are real, and there's tons and tons of victims that have come out since then. But there's also the other side that want to deny anything and cover up any sort of possible connections to any powerful leaders, whether political or religious, here in the state. Absolutely. And it's very interesting.
I've run into that as well. I mean, like, I'll just say, I don't think I touched on this yet, but this initial announcement of this investigation by the county sheriff's office, it kind of opened up a whole can of worms for me. Like, as I mentioned, I've been researching this stuff separately, but then once I heard about the situation with David Hamblin and David Levitt, I did a few pieces on that, and I continue to follow that story, obviously. But then it kind of led me to look into Utah in general. And I don't know why, but there's certain states where there's just some weird shit going on. Like Florida, I count Florida to be one of them. Utah is one of the others. And I did a piece that it kind of just basically opened up a can of worms where a number of people started to reach out to me, including people who are still living in Utah, former members of the Mormon Church and current members of the Mormon Church, because even that, you find like a divide. You find people who they consider themselves Christians or maybe even Mormons outside of the church, but they believe that, through their research, that the church was corrupted. There's kind of different theories. You'll find people who say the church was corrupted very much from the beginning. Look up Joseph Smith, look up the Freemason rituals and some of the similarities to the rituals within the Mormon Church. And then there's others who say, no, it got corrupted later around Brigham Young and that time period. And then others who are like, no, it's just a few bad apples. The church and the ideology and everything is fine. It's just that we've got these bad people mixed in there. I'm not Mormon, so I'm not an expert to speak on that. But there are those different beliefs. And so I've had former Mormons, current Mormons, and others reach out to me to share their stories, some of which I've reported on, some I've just kind of kept in my back pocket for now. And that led me to Kate Talley. That led me to somebody sending me that, who are the children lying? And then I also did a report on former head of the Mormon Church. His name is escaping me right now. Gordon something, I can't remember, but
Gordon B. Hinckley.
Gordon B. Hinckley, exactly. And that came to me again. I'm not a Mormon expert. So I've had to like learn the language, learn the lingo, and kind of learn about how the church works. And I was sent a VHS tape, which we digitized and we put on the internet for the first time ever, as far as I know, because this tape was originally circulated in the late 80s and late 90s by people within the Mormon Church who were accusing Gordon B. Hinckley, who was the leader at the time, not only of like homosexual activity, which was obviously frowned upon in the church, but homosexual activity with like young boys and with prostitutes and different things, right? So at the best case scenario, he was having extramarital affairs. At the worst case scenario, he was involved in abuse of children and of young boys. And so we put those tapes out there. But again, I didn't just throw it out into the internet and say, hey, let's figure this out. I went and tried to track down everybody that was in the short film who was interviewed. I found most of them are dead, unfortunately. I was able to corroborate it through one or two other sources, including a man who is now passed, who was involved in the production of this short film about Gordon B. Hinckley. His daughters had copies of their father kind of giving his last will and testimony and basically saying, hey, this is what I witnessed. This is what I know. I was involved in the production of this film, this and that. And so I took all that information, I put it into my articles. We put that video out. And then that led me even further to just looking into the history of ritual abuse within the Mormon Church, which unfortunately there's quite a bit. There's definitely a number of incidents which have been covered up over the years. And then from there, looking at the history of abuse, sexual abuse, child abuse, ritual abuse, et cetera, within the state of Utah itself. So not specifically within the church, but just the broader statewide thing. And we talked before about like the Zion Society, and there's other examples. And so it opened my eyes in a lot of ways because, like I said, I've been paying attention to Epstein, intelligence networks, the Finders, which was connected to intelligence as well. But there's also, the Mormon Church angle, and it's not to pick on the Mormons or anything like that. There, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of other churches, if not all of them, that have examples of this stuff. But there does seem to be some level, and this is not an area I've fully explored yet, but I've seen some things about connections between the intelligence networks, the CIA, and the Mormon Church as well, that there seems to be some overlap there and members and history and things of that sort. And a lot of people don't know that the Church of Mormon is actually one of the largest landowners in the entire United States.
Yep.
So they have a number of properties. They're very influential, very powerful political bloc, if you will. And again, depending on your theory or belief, that's either a cover for satanic activity or they're just representing their religious interests, and there's a few bad apples, et cetera, et cetera. But it's definitely much bigger than I first realized. It's not just this David Hamblin case. This is just like, that's why I kind of frame it as the Utah ritual abuse situation, because yes, it's about David Hamblin, it's about David Levitt, but then you can also look into the Church of Mormon and you can find decades of various people trying to speak out abuse, even going up till today. Like there's still scandals happening right now. And then you can find a similar thing with going back and looking at Utah and just, because if you don't know, for those who are tuning into this, like the founding of Utah is very much intertwined with the Mormon Church. Like they're all the founders of that state. A lot of the wealthy families and the family names go back to the early days of the church, including Hamblin, including Levitt. Those are names that you can find historically in the church. So it's a big topic. It's bigger than any one person can handle. So I'm grateful that there are other people who are diving into this and asking these questions. And like I mentioned, I've got a number of emails from people who've reached out and said, hey, Derrick, like I've lived in Utah my whole life, and here's something I saw or something I witnessed or things I've heard from friends. So I have no doubt that it is much more widespread than people even understand in the state of Utah. And of course, it doesn't surprise me that some people would want to turn a blind eye or kind of diminish that, because the people involved in this appear to be willing to commit murder to keep things covered up. That's just what I've come across. There's there's depravity, there's obviously child abuse, things like that. And then there's corruption in terms of police and maybe the judicial system helping cover up and let people, get away with things. And then it's the sort of thing, well, once they die, then maybe later on they're like, oh, we found out this person was up to this, we apologize, etc. Once they're dead and it's safe or whatever, right? And that way they can kind of keep it in this, like with Hamblin, like it was just one bad apple, just one person, but that person's gone now, so don't worry about it anymore, everything's okay. And that's just not the case.
So as somebody who's not only located in Utah, but somebody who's was born and raised in the state, somebody who was raised in the church, there are definitely strange things, and I can definitely say that some of the best people I know in the entire world are Mormons, are LDS. There is a difference between a Mormon and an LDS person, but that's more of a like in the weeds conversation for another day. But what I can say is definitely some of the best people I know are from within the church or former members and everything. And
sure.
So it's definitely not at least the belief itself, but I can say that there is definitely some deep-seated terrible things within the church. And I'm not sure if even a lot of members are even completely aware of it. Why I think this is incredibly important. It's kind of the same thing with the Catholic problem in the 80s with the boys, or the Boy Scout problem. How many people actually knew? How many of these people were aware? And then also how many people were aware and chose to not believe, which I think is a whole different side of things. I do find it incredibly interesting. One thing I do want to bring up real quick, I think this is a hopeful sign in the state, which I'm not sure if you saw this, but there was a law passed recently here in the state
I did see
that outlawed ritualistic child abuse. Now, the state or the state media, it was kind of interesting. There was very few people who reported on it accurately, and it was mainly written off as just another version of satanic panic, another version of this moral panic that's been brought on by, a terrified minority of people, and it's now making its way through the Utah Capitol. And it was just really interesting. Anyone who's interested in this stuff, there is this gentleman right here, Adam Herberts. He's one of the few story.
Who's been doing a good job out there. I give him credit for sure.
Yeah, he has been a great journalist when it comes to this sort of stuff. So definitely go check him out. Anyone who's interested, he is a Utah-based reporter here for Fox 13, which is just a Fox affiliate.
I hadn't seen that, but I mean, as you were talking about it, I looked it up real quick, and of course, I find an NBC article that says Utah bill advances bill to criminalize ritual abuse of children, an echo of 1980s satanic panic. And like you said, they're just that makes me curious though, because this was earlier in the year. And the picture I'm looking at here, it says that Utah County Sheriff Mike Smith testified in support of the bill, and he's the one who initiated this investigation. So I'd be curious to go back and find that testimony to see if he says anything in relation to his ongoing investigation, because of course NBC. Let me just check. This might even be written by Brandy. Yeah, it was written by Brandy Zadrozny, of course. So she's going to say satanic panic. It's not a surprise. Yeah. And my guess, if I read through this article, she'll make no mention of the fact that David Hamblin has been arrested, that his wife has been arrested. It's just echo of satanic panic. That's just the way they do things, man. And I'm glad to see that bill's getting out there now. Unfortunately, it's sad that we live in a world that even needs to be put into law to like, hey, by the way, ritualistic abuse of children is wrong and it's illegal now. But I mean, that's where we're at, right? And thankfully, there are some people in Utah stepping up to the plate on that. And it's sad that there you go. Yeah, that Brandy, of course, she does what she does. You can look at any of her articles and it's going to dismiss everything as QAnon, satanic panic. But like I mentioned earlier, I encourage people to listen to my conversation with her, because you can see how hollow she really is, and that she just is an order follower. That's what it comes down to, is that most of these people are order followers. They're not actually trying to get to the truth. And I wanted to mention a couple other things, if I could, real quick, because I'm going to have to leave shortly. For those who don't know, I don't know if we mentioned this last conversation, but I have a documentary series called The Pyramid of Power. You can check it out at thepyramidofpower.net. It's a 17-part documentary series. We've just released the 14th episode about a month ago. And just this morning before our conversation, I was watching the first draft of our 15th episode, which will be coming out later this month. And it's called The Pedo Class. And it's all about this whole situation here. And so the episode's probably going to be about 40 minutes or so. I try to keep them as short as possible, as succinct as possible. And we look at this issue from a society-wide perspective. So some of this I've already covered here, like, why is it that this is prevalent in religions? Why is this that it's prevalent? And you can find examples of child abuse in schools, and security guards, teachers, pastors, the Boy Scouts, right? It's a society-wide problem that we have to deal with, and we have to be honest about if we're ever going to put an end to it. Because dismissing it all as satanic panic, like you said earlier, like, it's okay to talk about child abuse, but then the moment you mention there might be some ritualized element, or that it might involve a certain religious group, then it's crazy. It's nonsense, right? But people can understand these things individually, separately. Why then is it so hard to understand that perhaps there are people who are organized about their abuse? It's not just random, like you left the kid home with the babysitter and they got abused. Yes, that does happen, but it appears that there are way more organized aspects to this, that there are people who are legitimately coming together and saying, like, hey, let's have a little abuse party, or whatever you call these kind of sick things. And so this next episode is going to be really important, and I encourage people to stay tuned for it, because it's going to be, it's good. I have a whole segment on the Utah ritual abuse that sums it up and kind of takes, goes through what we've covered here today a bit more succinctly. And then we have a part of the episode focused on the finders. And the finders is important because when I released that documentary in February 2019, 7 months later, the FBI started releasing documents related to the finders case. I didn't file open records requests. I know other people had. I'm not saying the timing was because of my documentary, but it was definitely some coincidental timing. Yeah, I put out my documentary. Nobody's talking about this case. All of a sudden, they start dropping document dumps, which confirm what I was reporting. And so this next episode of the Pyramid of Power, Chapter 15, the Pedo Class, the segment on the finders is almost like a Finders Part 2, if you will. It's not a full hour-length documentary like the first part is, but it catches people up to what's happened since then. Because after that film came out, and in the film, I was able to interview one of the former members, the spokesman of the Finders. He didn't like my film at all, and I went and interviewed him again and gave him a chance to say, his piece and everything. But he still couldn't tell me, well, why does this police document say that the finders was connected to the CIA? Why did it say that there was, signs of child abuse at first, and then later on that magically changed? And he had no good answers. And so the reason I bring that up is because I'm trying to continue producing content about this topic and so many other things, but in a format that is not the crazy QAnon stuff that does exist, that does make wild claims about all kinds of things that can't be proven, but in a factual, objective, documented way that can, debunk the Brandys, the Drozny's of the world by showing, like, look, we have the evidence, we have the data, people are speaking out. And so I just wanted to mention that because it's not out yet, but we're hard at work on that. That'll be out later this month. And I'm really excited to get that one out. Unfortunately, it's not, it's not fun content. It's a dark and disturbing issue, but I'm excited to get it out because it's so important. And because until we can really get people to wrestle with the facts that the satanic panic was not just people freaking out and hysteria and nothing here, nothing to look, nothing to see here. There are real documented cases. And at the same time, things like QAnon and other things, in my view, those were psychological operations done on purpose to discredit the cases like this, to discredit the finders, to discredit the Franklin scandal, to discredit the Utah ritual abuse case, Jeffrey Epstein, et cetera, and to misdirect people. Because the QAnon thing says, oh, it's just the Democrats. The Democrats are the crazy ones. They're the only ones up to this. You can find plenty of examples, including the Franklin scandal and others, where there were Republicans involved in these types of things. And I by no means is this a partisan issue. It's beyond that garbage, right? But so there's been a lot of, there's the Brandys, the Drozny's trying to tell people this is satanic panic 2.0, pay no attention. And then there's the QAnon types kind of like actual fake news, disinformation, so-called truthers who are misdirecting people and getting them to look at only one side of the equation. What I'm trying to do with my work in general and with this upcoming episode of the Pyramid of Power is really have it be as objective, like with all of my episodes, the transcripts there, all my links, everything, and people can do the research themselves. But I just wanted to make that note that if you're not following the Pyramid of Power, please do check it out and stay tuned, because we'll have a really well done documentary episode on this coming soon that you can share with your friends and family and hopefully get more people talking about this. Because as I mentioned earlier, like, Kate Talley has since become kind of a friend, an associate, that somebody that I do care about as a human being, even though as a journalist, she's just somebody I'm interviewing for an article. But she's a human who is watching, and very nervous that David Hamblin will be allowed out after what she witnessed and what she suffered from him. And plenty of other people have as well. So, that's where I think we need to just bring it back to. It's like, this is about the truth. This is about helping the victims, helping them find some kind of justice, and getting these horrible people behind bars and hopefully for the rest of their lives, like that they can never go free again. Because this is not just like, okay, I don't know, I abused somebody one time and I've changed my life and I've proven I'm a different person or something like that. This is like multiple incidents, in the hundreds of incidents,
generational,
numerous people, generational, intergenerational, psychological abuse, ritual abuse, and sexual abuse. Like, that's what this really is. And if those 2012 documents are accurate, then there is a cult of people that's in Utah. And by no means do I think it's only in Utah, but that exist in parts of Utah that are intergenerational families that have been passing down this sort of behavior and actions and committing murder and committing rape and abuse of children for decades now. And if that is anywhere close to being true, it needs to be stopped immediately. And so that's why I work on this topic, and I continue to report on it as developments happen.
Hey, Derrick, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I know, like you just said, this is not a warm, fuzzy topic, and it's not fun. I mean, even the other topic we discussed previously wasn't super fun, but this is really not that fun. So I want to thank you for coming on. I encourage everyone to go check out what he has coming up, and I myself have a bunch coming out as well. So go check out that False Memory Syndrome Foundation investigation I've been working on, and everyone else, go check out what Derrick has going on. Go scan that QR code right there, and hang out for just a sec, Derrick. We'll close up on the back end. Everyone else, until next time, stay free, my friends.